Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're going to talk about how often the acts of civil disobedience, whether they are peaceful or not, are often seen as evil by the population at that point. We see this so fucking much. But to start off with, let's show what our government has decided it's going to do. There are two bills. One has passed. This one has not. Yeah. But it's just saying, we strongly condemn and denounce the drastic rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and around the world. Motherfucker, have you not been paying goddamn attention? Fucking. It shows how goddamn sold out our politicians are to the fucking pro-Israel lobby. And when it passed the House, this resolution condemns and denounces all instances of anti-Semitism occurring in the United States and globally. Okay, I think normal people were for that, but the resolution also states that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and it is not. That's a fucking stupid ass fucks. The other one, this is the one that's become a law. Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. Oh dear. As you can see, it was introduced, passed the House, passed the Senate, to the President, became law. So this one is officially a law. The bill provides statutory authority for the requirement that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights take into consideration the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism when reviewing or investigating complaints of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. According to the IHRA's working definition, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Motherfucker. It isn't hatred toward Jews that's happening right now. It's hatred at the crimes Israel is committing. God damn it. But no. They see Israel as an extension of Judaism, which it is not. It is clear. It is not an extension. But they don't care. God, they don't fucking care. They don't give a fuck. Yeah. take a further look at this, see if they've got a different definition. More or less the same bullshit. It's just worded slightly different. But yeah, again, it's a bullshit fucking law. Again, let's say most people's qualms isn't against Jewish peoples. It's against what Israel is doing to innocents in Gaza. Period. Period. Fact. You know, that's just how it is. Get over it. But, oh, great and powerful. And this was a bipartisan past. 320 to 91, I think it was, in the House. Yeah, both parties' majority passed it, which shows they are just sold out. They don't give a shit about the people. So with that, let me move this over. We'll talk about the campus protest first. Campus protest over Israel-Hamas war. It's not a goddamn war. It's a genocide. Scaled down during U.S. commencement exercises. This was from 3 days ago, is what it says. Protests over the genocide have spread across U.S. university and college campuses in recent weeks, leading to disruptions and arrests. Some demonstrations extended into weekend graduation celebrations, although they were muted in comparison to the encampments and rallies that have roiled campuses and resulted in nearly 2,900 arrests of students and other protesters. Well, when you have police coming in, the National Guard coming in, all these militarized organizations to attack non-violent student protesters, then yeah. And then you've got commencement, graduation celebration there. So they will be tamed down a bit. But, yeah. Most of the commencement exercises took place as scheduled and remained largely peaceful. Here's a look at some of the ceremonies that included protest. Yeah, they remain largely peaceful. The only violence I see is when counter-protesters try to step in and protest for pro-Israel rights to genocide. Duke University, dozens of the 7,000 graduates at Duke left their seats to protest pro-Israel speaker and comedian Seinfeld during the commencement in Durham, North Carolina on Sunday. Some waved the red, green, black, and white Palestinian flag and chanted "Free Palestine" amid the mix of boos and cheers. Seinfeld, whose decade-long namesake show became one of the most popular, blah, 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 received an honorary doctorate from Duke. Stand-up comedian and actor has supported Israel since it invaded Gaza to dismantle Hamas after the organization attacked the country and killed some 1,200 people on October 7th. The ensuing war, you mean genocide? No, they mean war because they want to swing it a certain way. You know, they're trying to portray it a certain way in media, in the public. Has killed more than 35,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's health ministry. Pomona College, Southern California's small Pomona College, moved Sunday evening's commencement 30 miles to the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles after pro-Palestinian protesters set up an encampment last week on the campus's ceremony stage. A few dozen pro-Palestinian demonstrators tried to block access to the graduation event. Anwar Mohammed, a Pomona senior, said that the school repeatedly ignored calls to consider divesting its endowment funds from corporations tied to the war in Gaza. We've been time and time again ignored by the institution, Mohammed said outside the shrine on Sunday. So today we have to say it's not business as usual. Emerson College. Student protesters at Emerson College in Boston occasionally erupted into chants during Sunday's commencement ceremony, trying to disrupt the event. Several speakers stopped briefly and then spoke louder when the chants died down and ended. Some graduates wore Palestinian keffiyeh scarves. Others took off their graduation gowns and dropped them on the stage after receiving their diplomas. Virginia Commonwealth University. Dozens of graduating students at Virginia Commonwealth walked out Saturday during an address by Glenn Youngkin, while some of the estimated 100 students and family members who left during the Republican governor's speech showed support for Palestinians. Others held signs signaling opposition to Youngkin's policies on education. Yeah, one thing you got to remember, they passed a law to allow universities bipartisanly to attack anti-Semitism. I thought you wanted to defund education, motherfuckers. That was this policy you called for all this time. But, yeah, again, it shows the bullshit they're full of. University of California, Berkeley. At the University of California, Berkeley on Saturday, a small group of pro-Palestinian demonstrators waved flags and chanted during commencement and were escorted to the back of the stadium, according to San Francisco Chronicle. When there were no major counter-protests, but some attendees voiced frustration. Well, how do you think the protesters fucking feel, you dipshits? University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill splattered red paint on the steps of a building hours ahead of the school's commencement and chanted on campus while students wearing graduation gowns posed for photos, the Charlotte News and Observer wrote. University of Wisconsin-Madison. Small groups of protesters at the University of Wisconsin-Madison staged what appeared to be silent protest during commencement at Camp Randall Stadium. A photo posted by the Wisconsin State Journal showed about 6 people walking through the rear of the stadium. 2 carried a Palestinian flag. A spokesman for campus police said the group, which he believed included students because they were wearing caps and gowns, was kind of guided out. But they left on their own. No protests or no arrests were made. Pro-Palestinian protesters at the campus had agreed Friday to permanently dismantle their 2-week-old encampment and not disrupt graduation ceremonies in return for the opportunity to connect with the decision makers who control university investments by July 1st. University of Texas at Austin. At the University of Texas at Austin, a student held up a Palestinian flag during Saturday's commencement ceremony and refused to leave the stage briefly before being escorted away by security. Northeastern University in Boston, commencement ceremonies for Northeastern University were held peacefully in the rain on May 5th at Fenway Park. Some students waved small Palestinian and Israeli flags, but those were dotted among flags from India, the U.S., and other nations. Undergraduate student speaker Rebecca Bamadel drew brief cheers when she called for peace in Gaza. Police arrested about 100 protesters at Northeastern last month when they broke up the encampment on campus. Ohio State University. 53-year-old woman fell from the stands to her death during the May 5th graduation ceremony for Ohio State University. Officials said the woman's daughter was among those receiving a diploma. The fall happened around midday near where the last graduates were filing into Ohio Stadium. Columbus Dispatch reports the death is being investigated as an apparent suicide, citing coroner documents. University of Michigan. Police officers stood nearby as some graduates holding Palestinian flags and shouting "No Palestinian" messages pro-Palestinian messages protested during commencement at the University of Michigan on May 4th. Banner said no universities left in Gaza. The protests were located away from the stage and didn't stop the nearly 2-hour event. Protesters had demanded Michigan cut financial ties with any companies connected to Israel. The university allowed protesters to set up an encampment in the middle of campus. Yeah, like I said, it was graduation ceremonies and the overly militarized use of police and the National Guard to break up protests has caused, some issue with these protests, these encampments. Most Americans disapprove of Israel's actions in Gaza, according to a poll. Now, this is an older article, March the 27th. So towards the end of March. But poll shows clear disconnect between President Biden's policies and the U.S. public, especially Democrats. The majority of Americans disapprove of Israel's actions in Gaza, a new poll has shown, as the Israeli military continues to pound the besieged Palestinian enclave. The Gallup poll released on Wednesday found that 55% of respondents disapproved of the Israeli military's actions in the Gaza Strip, up from 45% who say they disapproved in November. And so I'm sure it's probably only raised since then. Although they've there's no problem in crashing and destroying student encampments and being verbally attacked on mainstream media. So, yeah. So, I mean, it just shows America has a history. It, this is what we're getting into now. America has a history of hating protests, even though it's guaranteed by our First Amendment right. 2003 article, but still. Make love, not war. Posters have resurfaced recently as thousands of Americans have participated in the anti-war demonstrations against war in Iraq. Yeah, you gotta remember the Iraq War had just started. Gallup polling since Vietnam has attempted to assess Americans' participation in the anti-war protest and also Americans' views on the protests themselves. Only a very small percentage of Americans say they have participated in protests. Americans recognize the right of people to protest, but significant numbers, sometimes a majority, would prefer there be no protests during wars involving U.S. troops. Shit, not even involving U.S. troops, as we're seeing in the genocide committed by Israel. The Vietnam era. The 1960s was a time of social upheaval in America. Although minor protests against the U.S. intervention in Vietnam occurred in 1963, the anti-war movement did not begin to swell until 65, when President LBJ, President Johnson, ordered considerable U.S. military intervention and continual bombing of North Vietnam. In April of 65, the first large-scale march on Washington drew 15,000 to 25,000 people to the Capitol. In 67, Gallup polling asked Americans if they had ever participated in a peace rally on Vietnam. 99% said they had not. When those who had not participated were asked if they would like to participate if such a rally was organized in their area, only 9% said yes. So yeah, most of them were like, I'm back destroying poor Asian people in Vietnam. In 1968, of course, it's always seen as, we're fighting communism. In 1968, Democratic Convention convened in Chicago at the height of unrest over the war in Vietnam. Yeah, the infamous year, 68. War protesters and 12,000 police officers clashed. More than 500 people were arrested and several hundred police officers and demonstrators were injured. When asked if they approved or disapproved of the way the Chicago police dealt with young people who were registering their protest against the Vietnam War, 56% of Americans approved of, the way police treated protesters. So that's a slight majority. And they had no problem with police beating the shit out of people who were protesting. 31% disapproved and 13% had no opinion. By October of 69, as anti-war fever continued, more than 2 million people participated in nationally coordinated Vietnam moratorium protest. 20 plus years later, March 1990, Gallup asked the public if it wished it had made a stronger effort to protest or demonstrate against the war in Vietnam. 25% of those polled wished they had, while most 67% did not. The same poll found Americans divided in their evaluations of the Vietnam War protesters. 39% said they had a favorable opinion, and 39% said they had an unfavorable opinion. So, as you can see, trying to protest an unfair war, yeah, most Americans are like, you're just interfering with life. Motherfuckers. You've got to stand up. Even when life is at its worst, you've got to stand up and push back against what's wrong. The Gulf Wars. It had been nearly 20 years since the last major war protest when America led an attack on Iraq in 1991. We're talking about the first Iraq War. Polling conducted at the outset of the Persian Gulf War showed that Americans preferred that there be no protests, but would stop short of a ban that intruded on others' rights. A January 1991 Gallup poll found the majority of Americans, 57%, saying people who opposed military action should stop the protests now that the war had begun, while 38% said they should continue the protests during the war. However, when free speech issue was raised in a question asked in the same poll, only 23% preferred a ban on the protest in order to support the U.S. military operation, while 66% said the government should permit continued anti-war protest under the free speech guarantees of the Constitution. A subsequent poll conducted January 23rd through 26th, 1991, underscored Americans' preference against anti-war protests. 34% said it was a good thing that those who disagree with the government are speaking out, while 63% said it was a bad thing for Americans to be demonstrating against the war when U.S. troops are fighting overseas. It shows how much of the American public is brainwashed by the military-industrial complex. Gallup asked Americans in February 1991 if they had participated in a demonstration for or against war with Iraq. Just 5% had participated and 95% had not, somewhat higher than observed in the earlier stages of the Vietnam War. The long build-up to the current war with Iraq gave potential protesters time to organize peace rallies before the bombs began falling. In addition, the fact that web-based communication was not as readily available yet during the first Gulf War has made planning and spreading the word about peace demonstrations much easier now. In January 2003, 70% of Americans told Gallup they think it's okay to protest, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with the protesters. And just 26% do not think protesting is okay. That is a rarity compared to what we had been seeing. However, a majority of Americans, 58%, said they disagreed with the protesters at that time. Remember, we're in the midst of 9/11 fever in January 2003. You would be questioned as an American, as a patriot. You know, you need to fight for America's right for freedom. Freedom prize! Now that the war has started, those views have changed somewhat, becoming slightly less favorable to protesters. A March 22nd to 23rd CNN USA Today Gallup poll shows 69% of Americans disagree with the protesters, up from 58% in January. Majority, 57%, still say it's okay for them to be protesting, but this is down from 70% in January. 41% of Americans do not think the protesters should be demonstrating. Gallup polling since the Vietnam War shows a rather low rate of participation among Americans in anti-war protests. Meaning Americans would prefer there be no protest, especially once war has begun, but at the same time, most recognize the free speech rights of those who oppose the government's action. This is from Jacobin. We're going to now look at the protest popularity during the Civil Rights era and Martin Luther King. Polls showed many Americans opposed the civil rights protests in the 1960s. But that changed. Don't let the opponents of the current racial justice protest fool you by citing public opinion polls. Such polls have showed the majority of Americans opposed to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. This was during, I think, the Black Lives Matter protests. Yeah. Public opinion is not immovable through protest. If you find yourself playing pundit and citing current polling as proof that today's civil rights protest against police violence and calls to defund the police will inevitably fail, do yourself a favor. Pause and look back at the polling from the last successful civil rights uprising in American history. Many fondly remember the successes of the mid-20th century civil rights movement, but the adversity of the headwinds the movement faced are often elided in our history books. That can end up leaving the impression that most of the American public must have supported the peaceful protest of MLK and other civil rights heroes. But that wasn't the case. Here are some data points from back then. 61. Americans were asked whether tactics such as sit-ins and demonstrations by the civil rights movement had helped or hurt the chances of racial integration in the South. More than half, 57%, said such demonstrations and act of civil obedience had hurt chances of integration. In 1963, a Gallup poll found that 78% of white people would leave their neighborhood if many black families moved in. When it comes to MLK's March on Washington, 60% had an unfavorable view of the march. 1964. Less than a year after Dr. King's march, Americans were even more convinced that mass demonstrations harmed the cause, with 74% saying they felt these actions were detrimental to achieving racial equality and just 16% saying they were helping it. 1964 again, a majority of white New Yorkers questioned here in the last month of the survey by the New York Times said they believed the Negro civil rights movement had gone too far. While denying any deep-seated prejudice against Negroes, a large number of those questioned used the same terms to express their feelings. They spoke of Negroes receiving everything on a silver platter, and of reverse discrimination against whites. More than one-fourth of those who were interviewed said they had become more opposed to Negro aims during the last few months. 1965, in the midst of the Cold War, a plurality of Americans believed that civil rights organizations had been infiltrated by communists, with almost a fifth, 20% of the country unsure as to whether or not they had been compromised. The civil rights movement faced these steep odds, but kept organizing and protesting, and ultimately changed public opinion and passing landmark civil rights laws, despite the naysayers and the skeptics. Now, just more proof of how Americans don't like protests. But they are ultimately the right thing to do. And finally, from Gallup, protests seen as harming civil rights movements in the 60s. At current times, reflection on MLK's life often involves celebrating the nonviolent tactics he advocated as key to much of the civil rights movement's success. At the time of his leadership in the 60s, however, Americans held a very different views on the effectiveness of mass demonstration, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience. In an early Gallup question on the issue, Americans were asked whether tactics such as sit-ins and demonstrations by the civil rights movement had helped or hurt the chances of racial integration in the South. More than half, 57%, said such demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience had hurt chances of integration, while barely a quarter, 27%, said they had helped. This was in the 60s while they were going on. Again, Americans saw these demonstrations and protests as detrimental. Gallup asked this question in May of 1961. At that point, 7 years after Brown versus the Board of Education struck down the doctrine of separate but equal, Americans had become familiar with the demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience as leaders of the civil rights movement sought to desegregate the country. Sit-ins in particular had captured the country's attention after 4 college students had used the tactic at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in February 1960, sparking a wave of similar acts. 2 years later, shortly before the Reverend King's August 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and I believe that's when the I Have a Dream speech happened as well, Gallup again probed Americans' views of the civil rights movement. This time the question asked about the impact of the broader pursuit of racial equality in that June 1963 survey. 60% of Americans said mass demonstrations hurt efforts to bring about racial equality. And 27% believed it helped. They helped. So again, it's people not liking demonstrations, not liking protests. It's often history and time that shows that these were the right actions. And again, it'll show the same with these protests of the Gaza genocide. Right now, most Americans are against the right for these protesters to protest. Our government is pushing back. But history and time will show it's the right fucking movement. And that's what I wanted to show with this video. No matter how hard there is a push, history will show the truth. It always does. Like I mentioned in another video, the Tulsa race riots. I didn't even know about them when I was a young boy, and a young man hitting into my early 20s. I had never heard of it. But here it is, 2 decades later, and it has been made aware, America has been made aware of it. Of the despicable behavior and acts committed. Unfortunately, while history will show that these student encampments and protests are the right thing, that being against Israel is the right thing, in the meantime, they're getting away with it. And it just isn't right. It really isn't. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting links in the description box below the video. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.